The noise had been building since just past midnight, when the owls arrived thick and fast, and somebody out in the high street set off fireworks that rattled the Hogshead's windows like a minor earthquake. Aberforth Dumbledore did not go to the window to look. He refilled a glass instead. Set it down in front of the hooded figure who had occupied the corner table for the better part of 3 hours, and who had drunk steadily and said nothing, and who Aberforth respected for both of those qualities. The fire in the grate was the only warm thing about the room. The floor, the walls, the smell, something ancient and resentful that no amount of mopping had ever fully addressed, were what they had always been. He kept it that way on purpose. It discouraged a certain type of patron. He had grown over the decades to appreciate which type that was. The street erupted again, voices in chorus, disbelieving, wild with relief. He caught the words, "He's gone," twice, and "The Dark Lord" once, and "We're free," in a register that grated against something in his chest, like a fingernail against slate. He knew what they meant. He had been passing information to his brother's order since before half of those people had been born, and he understood exactly what the fall of Voldemort cost, and exactly which names were absent from the celebrating crowd, because the war had taken them before the victory arrived. He had no particular desire to stand in the street and shout about it. He served 2 more drinks and swept up a broken glass and told a customer, kindly but firmly, that it was time to find somewhere else to sit, and the evening proceeded the way evenings in the Hogshead generally proceeded, which was to say, it proceeded at the pace of something wounded, moving toward somewhere quieter. Most of the patrons filtered out. The noise from the street crested and receded in waves. The fire settled. Then the door opened, and Elphias Doge came in from the cold. He was ancient, about as ancient as Aberforth, which people tended to forget, because Elphias had the look of a man who had aged in the conventional direction. He wore his years like a well-kept coat. He had been Albus's closest friend since the day they both arrived at Hogwarts, which made him, in Aberforth's private accounting, a man worth watching carefully, and a man worth listening to, when he turned up somewhere he had no particular reason to be. He was also still wearing Wizengamot robes, which meant he had attended whatever official celebration had been organized for the occasion, and had then come here instead of going home. That was interesting, Aberforth, Doge said. His voice had something wrong in it. Not grief. Not quite. But the particular strain of a man who has been told something in a language he understands perfectly, and has spent the past hour failing to make it feel real. Aberforth set a glass on the bar without being asked. The hooded figure in the corner had gone to sleep, or was performing sleep, with some conviction. Neither possibility troubled him. Doge looked at the glass. "He's placed the boy," he said. "James and Lily's son, Harry. Albus has placed him with Lily's Muggle sister, tonight in Surrey." Before anyone was consulted, before anyone was told a decision was being made, Aberforth waited. Hagrid made the delivery, on Sirius Black's motorbike. Sirius turned up at Godric's Hollow to take the boy himself. He's the godfather, it was in the will, and Albus had already sent Hagrid ahead, so Sirius lent Hagrid the motorbike and left. Doge paused. "Sirius is in ministry custody now, something to do with Pettigrew. The details are still coming in." Aberforth said nothing. He wiped the bar in slow, even strokes. "There was a letter," Doge said. "Albus left a letter. He finally picked up the glass." "I thought you should know. I thought someone should say it plainly." "The boy's parents are dead less than 4 hours, and Albus has determined his future, and nobody has asked anybody anything. And I came here because—" He stopped. "I'm not entirely sure why I came here." "You thought I'd say it was wrong," Aberforth said. Doge was quiet for a moment. Is it? Aberforth set down the cloth. The fire popped. Outside, someone had started singing again, a song he half recognized, something about dark times ending. He had heard variations of that song at intervals across his life, and had never quite managed to believe. He thought about a room he hadn't entered in 82 years. He thought about a girl who had been given no choices, either not about what had been done to her when she was 6, not about the great plans that were supposed to fix everything, not about the night in 1899 when 3 men had fought in a small room. She had not been consulted in the language Albus would have used. She had been accounted for, protected. Her welfare had been a variable in a calculation that was, in the end, still a calculation. He was sleeping, probably. He had to be sleeping in a house he had never seen, beside people who had not asked for him, because Albus had run the numbers, and the numbers had come up sorry. It was not a new method. That was what sat in Aberforth's chest and would not go out. "I don't know the sister," he said at last. "Never met her. She and Lily weren't close, far as I knew. But that's not really the thing, is it?" Doge looked at him. "What is the thing?" "The thing," Aberforth said, "is that nobody asked, nobody thought to ask." He looked at the door, which was closed, which was holding out the singing and the fireworks and the relief of a world that had just been handed back to itself at considerable cost. "The thing is that there is a boy on a doorstep in Surrey, and there is a godfather in ministry custody, and my brother sent a letter and called it done." Doge was quiet for a long moment. He drank his drink. He set the glass back down carefully, as though it might break. "Go home, Elpheus," Aberforth said. Doge went home. When the last of the regulars had shuffled into the night, and the fire had burned to a red smear in the grate, and the high street had quieted to distant laughter and the occasional crack of a final celebratory spell, Aberforth bolted the door and stood behind the bar and did not move for a while. The hogshead looked exactly as it always looked. He had been standing behind this bar for longer than most wizards had been alive. He had stood here through a war and was apparently going to stand here through whatever came next, unless he chose otherwise. He had chosen silence before. He knew the shape of that choice. He knew how it looked at 10 years' distance, and at 20, and at 80, and he had some familiarity with how it would look on the last morning he was likely to have, and he had long since decided that it did not look good from any of those angles. The boy had no one asking the questions that needed to be asked. He locked up the till, and went upstairs and found parchment and a quill and sat down at the desk he normally used for the accounts, and he thought for a long time about what he meant to do, and whether it could be done, and whether he was the person to do it, and the answers he arrived at were in order. He started writing. The visitor entrance to the Ministry of Magic was a red telephone box on a side street in central London that smelled, on the morning of the 2nd of November, of cold air and stale magic, and the institutional anxiety of a building that had not slept. Aberforth fed in the coin, stated his name and purpose to whatever enchantment was listening, and clipped the visitor badge to his coat, with the unhurried manner of a man who considers bureaucratic procedure a minor obstacle to be cleared. The badge read, Aberforth Dumbledore. Purpose of visit. Legal filing. He looked at it and put it in his pocket instead. The ministry was in no particular condition. The corridors were full in the way buildings fill when they have been the center of an emergency and have not yet processed what the emergency means for the day after, people moving quickly without going anywhere, files carried at an urgent angle, conversations happening in undertones that conveyed importance without conveying information. A banner near the lifts read "The Dark Lord is gone" in large gold letters, and then had apparently been reconsidered because it sat in a corner now, with one end trailing on the floor, still pulsing faintly, not quite removed but no longer quite official. 3 Aurors passed him, carrying arrest documentation at a pace that suggested their mourning had already been complicated. A young witch near the water fountain was crying in the quiet, sustained manner of someone who has decided to get on with it regardless. He kept his hands in his coat pockets and walked. He was aware of being out of place, and did not particularly care. He was a pub landlord from Hogsmeade, known to the ministry primarily by virtue of a goat prosecution that he still maintained had been mischaracterized in the official record. The corridors communicated his foreignness through various architectural means. Ceilings too high, floors too polished, every person he passed making the same rapid assessment and the same rapid conclusion. He returned their glances with the flat regard of a man who has served drinks to stranger people in a dingier room. The Wizengamot Administration Services office was on the DMLE level, behind a frosted glass door, and was quiet in a way the rest of the ministry was not. There was a desk, a considerable number of files, and a clerk who looked up without visible alarm and waited. "I need to file a guardianship petition," Aberforth said. "Wizengamot jurisdiction, the ward is Harry James Potter." The clerk's expression did not change. This was, in the circumstances, professionally impressive. He picked up a quill, they went through it. Name of petitioner, relationship to ward, grounds, current legal guardian of record. Aberforth answered in the fewest words adequate to the purpose. When he named the ward's current residence, Lily Potter's sister, a house in Surrey, the placement made the previous night, the clerk consulted a second set of documents. "There is a named godfather in the associated family documentation," the clerk said. "Sirius Black, do you have information on his current legal status?" "He's in ministry custody," Aberforth said. "As of last night, charges?" "I don't know the charges. I know he's in custody, and I know the boy's named guardian can't act in that capacity from a ministry cell." He stopped there. There was more he could have said, and none of it was the scope of this filing. The ward is effectively without a functioning legal guardian on the wizarding side. That's why I'm here. The clerk made a careful note. The petition will need to reflect the godfather's circumstances. Then it will, more writing. Aberforth sat with the stillness of a man who has decided to do a thing, and is simply doing it. He had not slept. He was aware of this, as a fact, rather than a complaint. The clerk set down the quill. He folded his hands on the desk with the expression of a man about to deliver a procedural complication he would personally have preferred not to. "Your brother is Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot," the clerk said. "He is the respondent in this petition, the person whose placement decision forms the basis of the filing, would effectively be your brother. Yes, that creates a conflict of interest. The Chief Warlock cannot chair a hearing in which he is functionally a party. Another Wizengamot member will need to preside. Your brother will need to be formally notified and asked to submit a recusal." "That's fine. He'll receive notification today." "Good," he signed where he was asked to sign. The clerk stamped the filing, the 2nd of November 1981, and the sight of the date in official ink made the whole thing more solid than it had felt since he'd sat down at the desk the previous night. He asked how soon a hearing date could be set, was told it depended on the current state of the court calendar, which was in the present circumstances somewhat exceptional, and he did not argue because there was nothing to argue about. The telephone box put him back onto a London street that did not know or care what had happened in the wizarding world overnight. He stood on the pavement with the filing copy in his coat pocket and the name he'd written in the related parties section sitting in his chest. Sirius Black was 21 years old. Aberforth had seen him at order meetings, young, too quick with his own cleverness, constitutionally incapable of letting a silence stand if he could fill it with something. Also, the kind of person who showed up when required. Who said he would do a thing and did it? Who had gone to Godric's Hollow in the dark and tried to take the boy himself and been handed a motorbike instead and left empty-handed while someone else's decision stood unopposed? Now he was in a ministry cell without a charge, Aberforth had been told, without a trial anyone had mentioned. And the boy he had tried to claim was in a house in Surrey with a letter on the doorstep in place of anyone who knew him. Everyone who should have been responsible had failed. On the 1st of November, the godfather was in a cell, the boy was on a doorstep, and Albus had his letter and his calculation, and his settled certainty that the calculation covered everything worth covering, which was the part Aberforth had spent 82 years watching, and which had not improved with repetition. Aberforth took the train back to Hogsmeade. He opened the bar. He served the lunch crowd, which was sparse and distracted, still working through the previous night in the inconsistent way of people who had spent 11 years being afraid and were not sure yet what it meant to be otherwise. He pulled pints. He swept up. He settled a minor dispute about a tab with the brisk impartiality of a man who has heard every version of that argument there is. He put the filing copy in the drawer under the till, next to the bottle for emergencies, and a spare set of keys and one other thing he did not look at. He closed the drawer. The hearing would be scheduled. Albus would be notified today. What came after was no longer entirely within Aberforth's control, which suited him because control had never been the point. The point was to not walk past the gap and decide it was somebody else's problem to notice. He had done this. It was started. He tended the bar and waited, which were two things he had been doing, in various combinations, for the better part of a century. The owl arrived in the early afternoon, while Albus was pretending to read correspondence. He had been sitting at his desk in the headmaster's office since before breakfast, surrounded by letters he had already answered in his head and had not yet committed to parchment, because the act of writing them down would require him to stop thinking about the night before last. The fire was lit. The portraits of previous headmasters were doing what they always did when they sensed something significant was occurring in the room below them, which was to pretend very convincingly to be asleep. He had not slept himself. He was 100 years old and had not slept in 2 days, and he found he did not notice it particularly, which said something about the condition he was in, though he was uncertain what. The owl landed on the edge of his desk with the businesslike authority of ministry post and held out its leg. The envelope was stamped with a Wizengamot Administration Services seal. He opened it carefully, without any particular haste, and unfolded the document inside. He read it once. He set it down. He picked up his half-moon spectacles, which he had not been wearing, and put them on, and read it again. It was the handwriting that did it. Not the legal language, which was precise and expected, petition for wizarding guardianship, submitted by Aberforth Percival Dumbledore, petitioner, but the witness signature at the bottom of the accompanying declaration in his brother's hand. 82 years. Was a long time. You would think it sufficient to forget what a person's handwriting looked like, how the letters leaned slightly to the left, how the capital letters were always a little larger than strictly necessary, how the whole thing looked like the penmanship of a man who had learned to write correctly and then decided he had other priorities. You would think 82 years would be sufficient. He folded the document and set it on his desk. He looked at the fire for a while. He was not angry. That was the first thing he understood, and it surprised him a little. He had expected something sharper, some clean reaction that would tell him clearly how to feel about this. Instead, there was something more complicated, something that required more interior space than anger, recognition. He knew exactly why Aberforth had done this. He had known since the moment he placed Harry on the doorstep and walked away that this was the shape of the world he was walking back into, and he had decided anyway because the calculation was correct and the alternative was a boy growing up without the only protection that had any real chance of holding. He had made the right decision. He was quite certain of this. He was also certain that his certainty was not going to be the most persuasive argument available to him in a Wizengamot hearing. He spent 20 minutes composing his formal recusal notification and another 20 reading it over, not because it required revision, but because he wanted to be sure he was doing this correctly and without any contamination of the pride that wanted quietly to resist. He was Chief Warlock. He had been Chief Warlock for longer than most of his colleagues had been on the Wizengamot. The thought of sitting in that room as a respondent, on the wrong side of the table from the body he normally led, with another member presiding in his chair. He examined the thought carefully, the way you examine a tooth with your tongue to find the source of the ache. There it was, not small. He sent the recusal notification with the ministry owl and watched it leave through the window and did not permit himself any further examination. He would sit on the other side. He would answer. That was correct procedure, and he would follow it. The legal question was clear to him and had been clear since the moment the petition arrived. His brother was not wrong that the process had been irregular. Albus had not consulted the Wizengamot because there had not been time, because the blood protection had required speed, because every hour was an hour during which someone loyal to Voldemort might reach Harry first, and the charm needed to be in place before that happened. These were facts. They were not the kind of facts that played well in formal proceedings, because formal proceedings tended to deal in what should have happened, rather than what was operationally necessary, at midnight on the 1st of November. The charm itself was what mattered. He turned it over in his mind, as he had turned it over 100 times since he had cast it, checking the architecture of it, looking for the places where it could be misunderstood or undermined by a court that had never seen anything like it. When Lily Potter had chosen to die rather than step aside, she had created something extraordinary, ancient magic, the kind that does not appear in any textbook because it cannot be replicated by intention, only by love that is total and freely given and answered with death. He had built the bond of blood charm around that magic, like a frame around a fire. It required a blood relative. It required a home. It required that the relative take Harry in voluntarily, even if the voluntariness was grudging and furious and bitterly given, and as long as Harry could call that home his own. The protection held, Lily's sister. The charm was sealed, the protection was active. This was his argument, and it was a strong one, but he was too honest with himself not to see its weakness. The court could rule against him. The court could, in theory, assign legal guardianship to Aberforth and order Harry removed from the house in Surrey and placed with his brother instead. If Harry left that house, the charm broke, the protection vanished. He would be left exactly as unprotected as any other war orphan, and the thing that Lily had died to give him would be gone. Albus intended to explain this to the Wizengamot with all the clarity he possessed, and he intended to explain it in terms that made the consequence vivid rather than abstract. He was, when it was required of him, a very good explainer. There was one thing he had decided not to explain, unless he had no alternative. He thought about the prophecy, the way he always thought about it, at the edges carefully, the way you approach a fire that you know can burn you. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord. Born as the 7th month dies, the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. He had been carrying those words for almost 2 years. He had carried them through the Potters' deaths and through the night. He placed Harry on the doorstep and through all the days since, and the weight of them had not diminished, and he did not expect it to. If he disclosed the prophecy in open court, he disclosed it to 50 Wizengamot members and a court scribe and whatever record the administration services kept, and Voldemort was gone, but Voldemort's people were not, and he did not know which of the 50 could be trusted with intelligence of that magnitude. And the prophecy was the kind of intelligence that, if it reached the wrong hands, could cost Harry his life before he was old enough to walk steadily. This was not a theoretical concern. He would argue without the prophecy. He would argue the blood protection and the procedural necessity and the magical consequence of the court's interference, and he would hope that was sufficient. And if it was not sufficient, he would consider his options then. The afternoon light had shifted toward evening. He had been sitting at this desk for a long time. He stood, and the fire had burned low, and the portraits continued their performance of sleep with admirable commitment, and he moved to the window to look out at the grounds below, the lake, the dark treelin, the stars beginning to appear above the mountains. He caught his reflection in the glass. Half-moon spectacles, silver hair and beard, and the nose crooked, since August 1899, since the day they put Ariana in the ground and his brother had looked at him across the grave with 83 years' worth of future silence already forming in his expression, and had closed the distance between them and done something that Albus had. And some part of himself that he had never been able to entirely suppress considered fair. He thought about Aberforth standing in a Wizengamot hearing room. He thought about what his brother would say and how he would say it and which things would be true. He thought most of it will be true. That is the difficulty. That is what makes this not a battle but a reckoning. He straightened his spectacles. He went back to his desk. He wrote the letters he had been putting off, one by one, until the fire had gone to embers and the office was dark. Except for the glow of the portraits, he was quite certain were no longer asleep. The summons arrived on a Thursday, 4 days after Minerva McGonagall had first heard about the petition, and she received it the way she received most unwelcome news, without flinching, with a cup of tea already cooling on her desk, and with the private acknowledgement that she had been expecting it. She was 46 years old and deputy headmistress of Hogwarts, and she had spent the better part of 30 years doing her job well enough that she no longer needed to think very carefully about most of it. The summons, printed on ministry parchment in the usual official typeface and stamped with the Wizengamot Administration Services seal, informed her that she was required to appear as a witness for the Wizengamot hearing in the matter of Dumbledore A. P.V. Dumbledore, A.B.P., on the matter of guardianship of the minor H.J. Potter, date to be confirmed. She read it twice, folded it precisely along its original creases, and set it beside the teacup. She had been present at 4 Privet Drive Ive, on the night of the 1st of November. She had been a witness to what happened on that doorstep, and to what she had said about it, and to what had been done with what she said, which was that it had been acknowledged and set aside. The petition had been filed 6 days ago. It had not taken a particularly agile mind to conclude that someone was going to want her testimony. She sat for a while in her office and looked at the window, where the November sky was doing nothing in particular. The thing she found herself doing in the days since she had first learned that Aberforth Dumbledore had petitioned the Wizengamot was rehearsing. Not for the court, she had no interest in preparing a performance, but for herself, going back over the events of that night with the methodical precision she brought to any task that required her to understand something clearly before she could proceed. She had sat in her animagus form on a garden wall across from number 4, Privet Drive, for the better part of a day. She had watched the Muggle family inside, the large, red-faced man, the thin-necked woman, the boy in the push-chair who had spent the afternoon screaming for sweets in a way that impressed her, in a strictly technical sense, by its sustained volume and lack of result. She had made her assessment, which was professional and unflattering, and she was fairly certain accurate. And then Albus had arrived, and Hagrid had arrived with the baby. And she had said what she thought. "Couldn't you find anyone else? Any wizarding family?" She could still hear it in her own voice, the particular clip of someone trying to be reasonable while feeling something considerably less than reasonable. "I watched them all day. You couldn't find a worse family among Muggles." She had meant it. That was the part that sat with her most cleanly. She had meant every word, and she had been overruled, and she had gone back to Hogwarts and done her job, and told herself that Albus saw further than she did, that there were reasons she wasn't privy to, that he had never made a decision without a reason even when he didn't share it. This was true. She believed it. She still believed it in the general sense, though her confidence in his judgment on the specific question of 4 Privet Drive had not recovered to the level it had occupied before the 1st of November, and she suspected it was not going to. A Wizengamot hearing. Someone was going to write down what she had said on that doorstep, in ink, in an official record. Someone was going to ask her whether she had raised an objection, and whether the objection had been heard, and what had been done with it. And she was going to answer, because she did not lie to courts, and she did not intend to begin. The question was not whether to tell the truth. The question was what she owed Albus in the framing of it. She had thought about this more carefully than she would have liked over the past several days. Loyalty was a value she held without embarrassment. She was loyal to Hogwarts, to the people she had taught, to the colleagues she respected, and to Albus Dumbledore, who had given her this post and who had, in 30 years of working beside him, earned a degree of her trust that she did not extend easily and did not withdraw lightly. She was loyal to him. She was also loyal to accuracy, which had been her other constant and which had occasionally put her in the uncomfortable position of being loyal to 2 things that were not, in any given moment, pointing in the same direction. She had stayed silent for 6 days. She had considered whether silence was the right thing to offer him, whether stepping back from a hearing she had been summoned to testify in was even possible, whether her presence on the respondent's side if her testimony helped Albus, or the petitioner's side if it helped Aberforth, was hers to choose at all. And she had concluded, methodically and without any particular satisfaction, that it was not a choice she was being asked to make. She was being asked to say what she saw. That was all. What the court did with it was the court's business. Albus was capable of defending himself. He had been doing it for 100 years without her assistance, and he would continue to do so after her testimony, whatever it contained. She was not protecting him by holding anything back. She was protecting a version of her own comfort that she did not, in the end, find she was willing to pay for. She put on her outer robes and went upstairs. The headmaster's office was where it always was, which was to say at the top of a spiral staircase behind a stone gargoyle that she had been given the password to sometime in 1956, and which she used with the ease of long practice. She knocked once. She went in. Albus was at his desk. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping, though with Albus this was difficult to assess, since he had a talent for presenting the same composed, attentive face in most conditions. He looked up. He did not look surprised, which suggested he had also been expecting this. "Minerva," he said. "I wanted to tell you what I intend to say," she said without preamble, because she had found over the years that preamble with Albus had a way of becoming conversation, and this was not the kind of thing she wanted to approach sideways. I will say I was present at Privet Drive. I will say I objected to the placement. I will say I was overruled. I will not embellish, and I will not volunteer anything beyond what I am asked, but I will not omit anything I'm directly asked about either. There was a brief silence. One of the portraits on the wall made a small sound that might have been clearing its throat, and then thought better of it. "Yes," Albus said. "Of course." She looked at him. He looked back at her over his half-moon spectacles, with an expression she had seen before in various configurations across 3 decades. The expression of a man who is carrying considerably more than he has told anyone, and who understands, clearly. "I'm not asking you to lie," he said. "I never would." "I know," she said. "That's not what I came to discuss." "No," he folded his hands on the desk. "I appreciate that you came to tell me." She nodded, which was what she did when she had said what she came to say, and there was nothing further to add. She was nearly to the door when he spoke again. "Minerva." She turned. His voice was for a moment not the headmaster's voice or the chief warlock's voice, but something quieter and rather more tired. "Whatever you tell them, it's accurate. I know it is." The objection was real, and it was heard, and I had reasons for setting it aside, and I am going to spend considerable time in that courtroom explaining those reasons, and I would very much prefer that the court hear an honest account of what happened, rather than a version filtered through the assumption that honesty will damage me. She considered this. "In my experience," she said, "the truth generally does less damage than the alternatives." She left before he could agree, because she suspected he was going to, and she was not in the mood for it. The Wizengamot chamber was underground, reached by stone corridors that smelled of old magic and older stone, and it was larger than Aberforth had expected. He had not expected to have expectations about it, but there they were, confounded. The chamber opened up around him as he came through the entrance, a high-ceilinged space ringed with stone benches set in tiers, and on those benches, arranged with the settled patience of people who had been doing this for a long time, sat approximately 50 witches and wizards in plum-colored robes embroidered with a silver W at the chest. They watched him arrive. He looked back at them with the same expression he used on difficult customers and moved to the position he had been shown. The torches on the walls gave everything an amber quality that made the room feel older than it was. A chair sat in the center of the chamber floor, broad-armed and imposing, with iron manacles hanging open at the armrests. A clerk nearby explained, quietly and without apparent need for Aberforth's reaction, that, as this was a civil matter rather than a criminal proceeding, the restraints were symbolic and would not be engaged. Aberforth looked at the manacles and thought that the distinction between a room that had chains and a room that didn't probably mattered considerably more to some people than to others. The court scribe was already positioned to one side with parchment and quill, and had the practiced stillness of someone whose job it is to record rather than respond. At the head of the chamber, in the seat that Aberforth had been told normally belonged to the chief warlock, sat a witch he did not know personally, the presiding interrogator, older, her posture communicating without effort the authority of someone who has been doing difficult things in difficult rooms for most of her life. She met Aberforth's eyes briefly, and with no more or less warmth than she would presumably direct at anyone else which he found he respected. He had been standing at the petitioner's position for perhaps 2 minutes when he heard the door. He did not turn around. He was aware of Albus entering the way. You are aware of a change in air pressure, a quality of attention in the room, shifting slightly. some collective intake of breath that didn't quite happen. He heard the footsteps. He kept his eyes forward. Albus moved to the respondent's position. From the corner of his vision, Aberforth could see his brother's profile, the silver beard, the half-moon spectacles, the crooked nose that Aberforth's own right hand had put in that shape on a day in 1899 that he had spent 82 years not thinking about, and had spent approximately the last 2 weeks thinking about considerably more than usual. Albus sat down on the wrong side of the room. He did not look at Aberforth either, which was its own kind of statement. The interrogator called the hearing to order. The formal business came first: the nature of the petition, the relationship of the parties, the confirmation that the chief warlock had recused himself and that another member of the Wizengamot was presiding in his place. Aberforth answered the procedural questions in brief. He confirmed his name, his relationship to the ward, his residence at Hogsmeade. He confirmed that he was bringing the petition of his own volition and without legal representation, which had been his choice and which he was still comfortable with, because the argument he was making did not require embellishment. The interrogator asked him to present his petition. Aberforth stood up. He had thought in the days before the hearing about what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it, and he had concluded that the answer to the second question was, plainly, there was no version of this that needed ornamentation. The facts were the facts. On the night of the 31st of October, into the 1st of November, he said, "My brother placed the infant Harry Potter with a Muggle family in Surrey, without informing the Wizengamot, without contacting the boy's named godfather, who had expressed a wish to take the boy himself, without giving any other family member, myself included, the opportunity to come forward and offer a home." He paused, just long enough to let the item settle. The process was wrong. That's the first part of what I'm saying. The process was wrong, regardless of whether the outcome was correct, and this court is the body that should have been consulted, and it wasn't. He let that sit for a moment, and the room did sit with it. 50 people, in plum robes, watching him with the particular quality of attention that comes from people who are professionally accustomed to weighing things. "I am a member of the Potter boys family," Aberforth continued. "I am his great-uncle by the most direct line available. His parents are dead. His named godfather is in ministry custody. There is no one on the wizarding side who has been formally designated as responsible for his welfare and his decisions and his protection. I am asking this court to designate me, not to remove the boy from his current residence. I'm aware there are magical factors that the respondent will address, and the court can weigh them, but to establish that there is a person in the wizarding world who is legally accountable for Harry Potter, that someone's name is on a document, that the ministry can reach someone who is not my brother when something happens to that boy, because at present there is no such person." He sat down. The room was quiet, in the way rooms become quiet when they are processing something, rather than simply waiting. Several of the Wizengamot members appeared to be writing. The court scribe was certainly writing. The interrogator looked from Aberforth to the respondent's position. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, "you may respond." Albus rose. He was, Aberforth had to acknowledge without any particular pleasure, extremely good at this. He had been standing up in rooms full of people and saying things that mattered for approximately 70 years, and it showed in the way he rose. Not quickly, not dramatically, with the unhurried quality of a man who understands that the room will wait, and the room's experience-based assumption is that this will be true again. Aberforth watched him and felt something complicated in his chest that was not admiration and was not contempt, and occupied an uncomfortable territory between them. "My brother is correct," Albus said. A small silence. Not a dramatic one, but the particular silence of a room recalibrating. The process was irregular. I did not consult the Wizengamot. I did not contact the boy's godfather before Hagrid departed. I placed Harry Potter at 4 Privet Drive, Ive unilaterally, in the early hours of the 1st of November, and I informed no one before the fact and very few people after it. I am not going to stand before this court and argue that this was procedurally correct, because it was not. What I am going to argue is that this court's options going forward are considerably more constrained than the question of procedure might suggest. He held his hands lightly in front of him. He did not look at Aberforth when he spoke. He addressed the interrogator, and through her the assembled members. The night of the 31st of October required speed above all else. What was done that night, the specific placement, with the specific family, has magical consequences that are now facts rather than decisions. The charm required a particular household, a particular blood relative of Harry's mother, and that relative's willingness to take the boy in. She did. The charm is sealed. He let a beat pass. The question before this court is not whether my decision was correct in process. I have conceded that it was not. The question before this court is what it can and cannot do about a magical fact that already exists, and what will happen to Harry Potter's protection if the court's ruling disturbs that fact. He sat. The interrogator looked between them, with the expression of a woman who has heard the opening positions in a great many disputes and can already see, with professional clarity, exactly where this one is going to be difficult. She made a note. The court scribe's quill had not stopped moving. Aberforth kept his hands flat on the table in front of him and his expression steady. They had each said what they came to say. The arguments were in the room now, and the room would do what it did, which was to weigh. He looked at the manacles hanging open on the chair. He thought, the chains are symbolic here. He thought, yes, but they are still present. He thought that there was probably a lesson in that somewhere, and that he was not in the mood to pursue it. He returned his gaze to the interrogator and waited for the next question. Albus had asked for, and been granted leave, to present the matter of the blood protection in full, and Aberforth had no objection to this. He had always found it useful when people with a strong position presented it completely. It was easier to see where the weight was and where it wasn't. His brother rose. "I want to address Lily Potter's death," Albus said. "Not as a tragedy, though it is that and I don't minimize it, but as a magical event, because what I am about to describe to this court is first and foremost a piece of magic, and understanding it as magic rather than grief is necessary for the court to understand the decision I made and the constraint it has created." The room was still. 50 plum-robed figures had the particular quality of attention that emerges when something is about to be said that cannot be unsaid. When Lily Potter chose to stand between her son and Lord Voldemort, knowing what the result would be, knowing she would die, knowing she could not stop it, she made a choice. That choice was not simply the act of a loving mother. In the magical sense, it was a sacrifice freely given in the place of another ancient magic, the oldest kind, the kind that cannot be manufactured by wand or formula or intent, because it requires an absolute and uncalculated gift of self. He paused. He was not looking at Aberforth. He was looking at the interrogator and, through her, at the assembled court, with the manner of a man who has lived with a thing for a long time and is now being asked to explain it aloud for the first time in a formal setting. That magic, the product of her choice, lodged in Harry. It became a protection he carries in his own blood, and it will persist. I say this with confidence, based on the nature of the magic, as long as he can call the home of a blood relative his own. Aberforth noted the word choice. Can call, not does call, not feels. As long as he can call it home, regardless of whether he knows it, regardless of whether anyone has told him, regardless of whether he is happy there, Aberforth noted the word and filed it. I understood this, Albus continued, in the hours after Voldemort's attack on Godric's Hollow. I understood that the protection Lily had created was extraordinary but incomplete. Extraordinary because it is virtually indestructible once properly anchored. Incomplete because anchoring it required a specific act. It required a blood relative of Lily's to take Harry into their home voluntarily. Not as a favor, not as a legal arrangement, voluntarily, however, grudgingly. He reached into his robes and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. He opened it, he read from it, slowly, clearly, in the way of a man reading words he could have spoken from memory, but has chosen to write down in order to make them part of the record. She may have taken you grudgingly, furiously, unwillingly, bitterly, yet still she took you. And, in doing so, she sealed the charm I placed upon you. A small silence. The court scribe's quill continued without pause. The room around it was quiet. The words are addressed to Harry, Albus said, folding the parchment. He is 15 months old. He cannot understand them yet. But I want them in this record, because they describe precisely what happened and what it requires. Not love, not warmth, not welcome, only the blood and the roof and the act of taking him in. The charm I placed around Lily's protection required exactly that and no more, and Lily's sister provided exactly that. He set the parchment on the table before him. She opened the door. Harry crossed the threshold, the charm sealed. It is sealed now, as I stand here. Aberforth watched the Wizengamot. He watched 50 people doing the private arithmetic of a room that has been handed a fact that is difficult to argue with. Several of them were writing. One elderly witch near the back appeared to have stopped breathing entirely for a moment. The interrogator had her hands folded on the table and was listening with an expression so neutral it had become, in its extremity, its own kind of reaction. The court will wish to understand the consequence of any ruling that disturbs the existing arrangement, Albus said. He was moving into the third part of the argument now, the part Aberforth had been waiting for, and his voice had shifted subtly, quieter, more careful, the register of a man approaching the edge of something. If this court assigns legal wizarding guardianship to my brother, and if that assignment is accompanied by an order that Harry be moved from 4 Privet Drive, I've to my brother's care, the charm breaks. The protection Lily died to give her son is gone. Harry becomes a 15-month-old child with a mark on his forehead and no shield between him and anyone who knows what that mark means. His people are not. We have been arresting them for 2 weeks and we have not yet arrested all of them. Harry Potter's survival is known. His location, at present, is not. I placed him where I placed him because the charm would hold, and because the location would not be obvious to people who wish him harm. If this court moves him, that changes. He sat. He sat with the composure of a man who has made his strongest argument and knows it is strong, and is allowing the room to feel its weight without overselling it. Aberforth looked at the table in front of him for a moment. He looked at the interrogator, who nodded briefly, to indicate that he had leave to respond. He stood. The charm, he said, the charm that cannot be moved. The charm that has locked Harry in a specific house with specific people, and which will break if the court interferes. That charm was designed by my brother. He designed the parameters of it. He decided it would require a blood relative. He decided which blood relative he would approach. He decided the terms under which it would seal. He kept his voice level. He had prepared this point, and he was not going to rush it. I want the court to understand what it is being asked to accept. My brother designed a magical arrangement that, once activated, creates a situation in which no one can question his decision, because questioning it, or correcting it, or finding a different answer all carry the consequence of breaking the protection he built. He has constructed a position in which any move against him damages the child he claims to be protecting. He paused. I am not arguing that the magic is dishonest. I am arguing that the argument from magical consequence cannot be allowed to also serve as immunity from the question of process. He built the trap. He set the trap. And now he is standing here asking to be excused from answering for the trap because the trap is already set. He sat. The room was the kind of quiet that thinks. Albus had not moved. He was looking at the interrogator, not at Aberforth. His hands were still. His face was composed in a way that Aberforth had been watching across 8 decades. The face Albus put on when he had heard something that found purchase and knew it, and was deciding how to answer without showing that he was deciding. Good, Aberforth thought. Let him decide. The interrogator called a brief recess. The plum robes shifted and murmured. The scribe set down the quill for the first time since the hearing had opened, and rolled it carefully between 2 fingers, and appeared to be staring at the middle distance with the expression of a person who has just written something they are going to be thinking about for some time. Aberforth kept his hands flat on the table. He waited. He was, as he had reflected before, quite practiced at it. The hearing reconvened after a recess of 20 minutes, which had been long enough for Aberforth to drink a cup of tea that tasted of ministry provisions, and to conclude that the Wizengamot catering was consistent with the Wizengamot's general approach to comfort, which was to say, theoretical. When the plum robes had resettled, and the interrogator had called the room back to order, Albus rose to continue his response to the rebuttal Aberforth had made before the break. He was, Aberforth noted, composed in the way that things are composed when they have had time to find their shape again. The court should be aware, Albus said, of certain aspects of my brother's history that are relevant to the question of his suitability as a guardian. He did not say this with any particular relish. He said it as a man says, a thing that needs saying and would prefer to be doing something else. The Ministry of Magic's records show that Aberforth Dumbledore was prosecuted under the Wizengamot's jurisdiction for the use of inappropriate charms upon a goat. The details of the matter are a matter of ministry record, available to any member of this court who wishes to review them. He paused briefly. I raise this not to humiliate my brother, but because the court is being asked to assess his suitability to be responsible for a child, and his demonstrated relationship with ministry regulations seems relevant to that assessment. He sat. The interrogator looked at Aberforth. He nodded and stood. My brother is correct about the prosecution, he said. I was prosecuted. I maintain, as I have always maintained, that the specific characterization of events in the ministry record is somewhat liberally interpreted, but the prosecution is a fact, and I'm not here to relitigate it. Several members of the Wizengamot appeared to be making an effort to keep their expressions purely professional. Aberforth gave them a moment. I would like instead to ask the court a question about the standard being proposed. He turned slightly, addressing the interrogator, but aware of the 50 pairs of eyes on the benches above him. My brother has suggested that a past legal transgression constitutes evidence of unsuitability. I want to be clear that I'm not disputing this as a general principle. What I'm asking the court to consider is whether it applies equally or only selectively. He looked at Albus, then not confrontationally, just steadily, with the look of a man who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore has never been prosecuted for anything. I acknowledge this. What he has done is something the Ministry's records don't contain, because it was a private matter, because the relevant events involved no formal complaint, and because the person he was doing it with was at the time a young man rather than a public threat. He let a beat pass. In the summer of 1899, my brother and Gellert Grindelwald spent several weeks together at the family home in Godric's Hollow. They were 18 years old. They wrote letters. They made plans. The plans had a name, the greater good. The substance of the plans was that wizards should stop hiding from muggles and should instead rule them openly for their own benefit and the benefit of magical society. Aberforth looked at the assembled Wizengamot with the patient expression of a man delivering information he expects people to already know, because they do. The greater good, the same motto Grindelwald used when he subsequently spent the better part of 40 years actually doing what they had planned that summer, while my brother, to his credit, had changed his mind somewhere along the way, and eventually went and stopped him. He paused. Eventually, the room was very quiet. My brother's prosecution for Muggle subjugation planning, 0. Mine for an incident with a goat. 1. I'll leave the court to weigh the respective moral gravity of these on their own. He sat. Then he stood again, immediately, because he had not finished. There is one more thing I want to bring before this court. He waited until the room had resettled from its brief assumption that he was done. In January or February of 1980, he said, my brother came to the Hogshead Inn. I own that establishment. I am the barman. He came there for a private meeting. He did not discuss the nature of it with me, which was his right. It's a pub, not a conference facility. And he met with a woman who appeared to be interviewing for a position of some kind. I was not present for the meeting itself. I had my own customers to attend to. He had the attention of every person in the room, including Albus, who was absolutely still in the way that objects are still when they are choosing not to move. During this meeting, I became aware that there was someone else in the pub who was listening, a young man, close to the door that gave onto the area where my brother was conducting his interview. He had not been drinking. He had not been eating. He appeared to be listening. Aberforth looked at the interrogator. I removed him. That is the barman's prerogative. I removed him from the premises physically and without ceremony, and I went back to work, and I thought no more about it, because at the time it seemed like the sort of minor incident that pubs occasionally produce. He looked down at his hands. When he looked up again, he looked at the court rather than at his brother. Within 18 months of that evening, Lily and James Potter were dead. Their son was an orphan. And my brother was placing that son on a doorstep in Surrey, based on a calculation that he has not shared with this court. He let the sentence complete itself. I am not saying the two things are connected. I am a barman, not an investigator. What I am saying is that something was said in that pub on that night, that something was overheard by a man I threw out before he could finish overhearing it, and that something in my brother's arithmetic about Harry Potter's future apparently begins at that evening and has not been explained to this room. He addressed the interrogator directly. I would ask the court to formally inquire of my brother whether there is information relevant to Harry Potter's situation, information relevant to why that specific placement was made, information relevant to what danger the boy faces, and from whom that has not been disclosed to this proceeding. He sat. He did not look at Albus. The interrogator consulted briefly with the members on either side of her. She turned to the respondent's position. Professor Dumbledore. The court asks formally, is there information pertaining to Harry Potter's circumstances the reasons for the placement, the nature of any threat to the boy that is material to this hearing and that this court has not been given. The silence that followed was 8 seconds long. Aberforth counted, without making it obvious that he was counting. Albus rose. He looked for the first time since the hearing had opened, like a man who was carrying something he would have preferred to be carrying somewhere, other than here. "I would ask," Albus said, "for an adjournment until tomorrow morning." To consider how best to answer that question, the interrogator looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Granted," she said. "The hearing will resume at 9 o'clock. She called the room to order and then dismissed it. The plum robes began to gather and murmur. The court scribe rolled up several feet of parchment with the careful, practiced efficiency of someone who has a great deal of it. Aberforth stood. He gathered nothing, because he had brought nothing, and he walked out through the same stone corridor. He had walked in through, and he did not turn to look at Albus. He didn't need to. The adjournment was its own answer. The request itself was the thing. He had known, when he asked the question, that his brother would not be able to simply say no, and that saying yes was not something Albus would do in an open courtroom without preparation and conditions. He thought tomorrow, then. He took the long way back to the apparition point because there was no particular hurry, and he wanted to walk, and he had always thought better when he was walking, and there was considerable thinking to do. Nobody had thought to bring a larger chair. This became apparent the moment Rubeus Hagrid was shown into the Wizengamot chamber, and several members of the court had the experience of watching a man who was very nearly twice the height of anyone else in the room survey the available seating with an expression that was trying hard to be polite about the inadequacy it found there. The clerk of the court produced a second chair from somewhere, wooden, four-legged, not substantially larger, and positioned it beside the first, and Hagrid sat across both of them in a way that suggested he had done this before. He was 52 years old. He had a wild black beard that occupied approximately as much space as a medium-sized bush, and his hands resting on his knees were the hands of a man who spent most of his time doing things that required hands considerably larger than average. He looked at the chamber around him, the tiers of plum robes, the torchlit stone, the chains hanging open from the central chair, the interrogator at the head of the room, and had the expression of a man who is holding himself very carefully still because he has calculated that stillness is the correct thing to offer this room and is bringing his full capacity to bear on it. He was not, in Aberforth's observation from his position across the chamber, afraid. He was simply in a room that did not fit him by any dimension available, and he was managing this with what appeared to be considerable, quiet dignity. The interrogator confirmed his name, his position, his relationship to the parties, and to the knight in question. He answered each question in a voice that had been turned somewhat lower than its natural register, the voice of a man who has noticed that rooms like this respond better to a certain kind of quiet. "I was there," he said. "At Godric's Hollow and at Privet Drive after. I can tell you what I saw." The interrogator asked him to begin. He had gone to Godric's Hollow, he said, on Headmaster Dumbledore's orders. He had been told where to go and what to do when he got there. He'd arrived. He paused here for just a moment, and the pause had a different quality than the pauses that precede an attempt to organize information, which was how Aberforth identified it as something else entirely, and he had found the house, or what was left of it. Part of the upper floor was gone. He didn't go into detail about that part, and the interrogator didn't press him. Harry had been inside. He had been. Hagrid appeared to choose his next word with unusual deliberateness. All right, not hurt beyond the scar on his forehead. Sleeping. Actually, when Hagrid found him, which had seemed at the time like a mercy of some kind, the sort of small mercy you notice because everything around it is the opposite of merciful. He had picked the boy up. "He weighed nothing," Hagrid said. "Tiny babies always seem too small to me, but he was." He stopped. He appeared to be examining the floor in front of him for a moment. "He was 15 months old and he'd just lost both his parents and he didn't know it. He was just asleep." The chamber was very quiet. 50 witches and wizards in plum robes did not move. "He had a scar already," Hagrid continued, "on his forehead. Lightning bolt shape. I didn't look at it long. I just made sure he was breathing right, and I wrapped him up, and I carried him out." The interrogator asked about the motorbike. Hagrid confirmed it. A flying motorbike, borrowed from a friend. He was asked to name the friend. "Sirius Black?" he said. "It's his bike. Was his bike? He come to Godric's Hollow that night? Same as me. He'd heard what happened, I reckon. We was both there at the same time." The interrogator asked him to describe what Sirius Black had said. Hagrid looked at her steadily. He had the particular expression of a man who intends to say a thing completely and accurately, which Aberforth recognized as the expression of someone who has done the arithmetical work, of deciding that honesty is both the right thing and the only possible thing. "He said Harry should go with him," Hagrid said. "He said he was clear about it. He wasn't upset. He was very calm, actually, which was, well, he said Harry was his godson, and he was the godfather, and that meant Harry should come to him." He paused, and I told him I had me orders from Professor Dumbledore, and he argued a bit, but not long. He could see I wasn't going to change, and then he gave me the bike. He said, "Take it, you'll need it to get the boy there safe." And then he went. The interrogator asked, "Where did Sirius Black go?" Hagrid shook his head slowly. "I don't know for certain. I've heard since what they said he done. But I wasn't there for that part. I just took the bike, and I went." She asked, "When Sirius Black said Harry should come with him, did he give a reason, other than being the godfather?" Hagrid appeared to find this question slightly puzzling in the way that obvious things are sometimes puzzling when they are asked formally. "He said," Hagrid answered, with the patience of a man repeating something that does not seem to require repetition, "that that's what godfathers are for. The room absorbed this." The interrogator thanked him for the information and asked him to proceed to the events at 4 Privet Drive, Surrey. He described the journey, the motorbike, the night sky, the boy still asleep across his chest inside his coat. He described arriving. Professor Dumbledore was already there. And Professor McGonagall. He handed Harry to Professor Dumbledore. "I didn't want to," Hagrid said. "Let him go, I mean. I'd had him the whole journey and he'd woke up a bit, actually, over Surrey. Looked up at me for a moment. That green." He stopped. He breathed once, and the breath was the size of a bellows. "He had his mother's eyes," he said. "Even then, even as small as he was. Lily's eyes." Another pause. "I gave him to Professor Dumbledore, and Professor Dumbledore put him down on the step with a letter. And we waited till the lights went out inside." The interrogator asked whether anyone had objected to the placement at the time. "Professor McGonagall," Hagrid said immediately. "She said it wasn't right. She said she'd been watching the family, and they were. She had a strong opinion about whether they were the right people. She said it clearly, and Professor Dumbledore heard her." He folded his large hands together on his knees. "She wasn't happy about it. Neither was I, if I'm honest about it. But Professor Dumbledore had his reasons, and we both knew he had his reasons, and—" He stopped again. "He usually does," he said. "That's the part I kept coming back to, after he usually does. He looked down at his hands. He said nothing further. The interrogator thanked him and indicated that the court had no more questions at this time. Hagrid nodded once. He stood with the careful courtesy of a man extracting himself from two chairs that had never been meant to hold him, and crossed back toward the entrance with the same deliberate quietness he had carried into the room. He did not look at Albus. He did not look at Aberforth. He looked, for the most part, at the floor, with the expression of a man who has said what was true and finds that saying what is true is not always a relief. The door closed behind him. The room remained quiet for several seconds after the sound of his footsteps had gone. The court scribe was still writing, with the focused concentration of someone transcribing something they will be thinking about for considerably longer than the hearing lasts. Several members of the Wizengamot were looking at the space where Hagrid had been sitting, as if his testimony had left a shape in the air. The interrogator called a brief recess. The hearing reconvened at 9 o'clock, as the interrogator had ordered. The chamber had the quality of a room that has been anticipating something overnight and has not quite resolved the tension of waiting. The scribe's quill was freshly trimmed and ready at the edge of the parchment. The Wizengamot members had taken their seats with a speed that suggested they had been punctual by intent. Aberforth arrived first, which he had not planned but did not mind. He sat at the petitioner's table and looked at his hands, and thought about nothing useful until he heard the door, and then he did not turn around. The interrogator waited until the room had settled. Then she looked at Albus and asked the question again, the same question she had asked the day before that had earned the adjournment, whether there was information pertaining to Harry Potter's circumstances that was material to this hearing and that the Wizengamot had not been given. "Before my brother answers," Aberforth said, "I'd ask the court's permission to say something directly to him." A pause. The interrogator looked at him with the expression she wore when she was assessing whether a procedural irregularity was going to be worth the time it would take to address. Then she nodded. Aberforth turned in his chair. He looked at Albus. This was the first time since the hearing opened that he had looked directly at his brother for any sustained period, and he registered without particular satisfaction that the crooked nose and the half-moon spectacles were both exactly as they had been for 82 years, and that Albus looked precisely as composed as he always looked. With the addition of the quality he had noted after the Godric's Hollow argument, the look of a man carrying a weight that is heavier than the weight he is publicly holding. "Albus," he said. He used the name without ceremony. There was no title available that would have been right, and he had no interest in the wrong one. "I was at the Hogshead in January or February of 1980. I told the court yesterday what I saw. The meeting, the woman interviewing for a position, the young man I removed because he was listening when he shouldn't have been. I didn't know what was said at the interview. I've never known. And in the year and a half between that night and the night the Potters died, you never told me. You never told Lily or James what you knew, or if you did, you chose what parts to tell them. And then they were dead, and the boy was on a doorstep. And here we are." He paused. "The court is asking you whether there's something it hasn't been told. I'm asking you the same thing. And I want you to understand before you answer that I already know what you're going to say. The only question is whether you're going to say it in full or whether you're going to choose what parts to give us again." He turned back to the front. The room was still in the specific way of 50 people deciding not to move. The interrogator asked if he wished to add anything before the respondent. Answered he said he did. He had thought about what he wanted to say for most of the night, not because the argument was new to him. It was not new. It was the argument he had been making in various forms for the better part of 80 years in the conversations he'd had alone. which was the only kind available to him for most of that time, but because he had wanted to find the shape of it that the court could follow. He was not an elegant speaker. He was aware of this. He was going to say it plainly. "My brother is the most capable wizard of this century," he said. "I am not interested in disputing that. What I am interested in disputing is what he uses his capability for." He was looking at the interrogator, but he was aware of the entire room, and he spoke at the volume of a man who has adjusted his voice for a stone chamber and means every sentence to reach the back bench. He uses it to protect people. I believe this. He protected Lily and James Potter as best he could, and they died anyway, and I am not standing here to say it was his fault they died. What I am standing here to say is that he protected them, in a manner that he chose, from behind information that he held, and he did not ask them whether they agreed with his assessment of what they needed or how they needed it. He made that decision for them. He decided what they would know and what they wouldn't. He decided what the risk was and how to manage it, and he kept the whole of it inside his own head because he judged, and he is always judging. This is the engine of him. This is the thing that runs all day and night and never stops. He judged that it was safer to carry it himself. He stopped. He wanted to make sure the next part was heard separately. He has been doing this since he was 18 years old. My sister's name was Ariana. She was 17 when she died. There is not a person in this court old enough to remember 1899 who doesn't know the outline of what happened to her, and I will not lay it out in detail because she is dead and I am tired of being asked to perform grief for public record. What I will say is this: she was not told the things that were being decided about her. She was managed, she was kept, she was protected. Sincerely, I believe that. And she had no more say in the shape of her own protection than Harry Potter does in the shape of his. He looked at the assembled benches. My brother doesn't do these things because he is cruel. He does them because he has decided at some point in his past and never revisited the decision that he sees further than other people, and that seeing further is the same as being right, and that being right is sufficient justification for making the choice. He calls it protection. I call it governance by concealment. And I am asking this court, he let a beat pass, deliberate and measured, because this was the sentence he had arrived at somewhere in the small hours, not to ratify it. He sat. He did not look at Albus, a longer silence than the previous ones. The scribe's quill had stopped. Then Albus rose. I will answer the court's question, he said, without conditions, or rather with 2 conditions, which I ask the interrogator to rule on before I proceed. He held his hands lightly at his sides. He was entirely still in a way that was not the stillness of a man who has lost ground, but of a man who has come to a decision and is now inhabiting it with full weight. The first condition, that the testimony I am about to give, specifically the text of what I will read into this record, is sealed and not available for circulation beyond the members of this court and the sealed archive. The second condition, that every member of this Wizengamot is bound from this moment forward to treat the information as classified intelligence, not to be shared outside this chamber under any circumstances for the duration of their lives. The interrogator spoke quietly with the members to either side of her, then with several more. There was a longer deliberation than Aberforth had expected, which told him that the conditions were not trivial, even by the standards of a body that had been processing non-trivial things for the past several days. The conditions were granted. Albus reached inside his robes and withdrew a piece of parchment that was not, by any observable marker, different from other pieces of parchment. He opened it. He looked at the room for a moment, and then he looked at the scribe. and waited until the quill was poised. He read, "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches." His voice was the same voice it had been throughout the hearing, measured, clear, pitched for 50 people in a stone room, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal. But he will have power, the Dark Lord knows not. And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. He folded the parchment. He did not elaborate. He sat down. The silence that followed was the longest the chamber had produced in 4 days of hearing. Aberforth looked at the wall opposite him and said nothing. He was thinking. He had not known those words. He had known there was something. He had known from the way Albus had moved through the aftermath of the Hog's Head interview, a different quality to the urgency he usually carried, something that had pressed rather than pulled. He ran it through his mind once. Then again. Either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. He thought about what it meant to have carried that sentence since before the Potters were dead. He thought about what it meant to have placed a 15-month-old boy on a doorstep in Surrey, knowing those words about him. He thought about the blood protection and the sealed charm, and Albus's refusal to disclose until forced, and he tried to find, in all of it, a place where the knowledge of the prophecy changed his argument. He turned it over carefully, the way you turn over an object in your hands to look for the flaw, and he found, at the end of the examination, that it did not. It made Albus's fear more legible. It made the placement more explicable. It placed a whole weight of context around decisions that had seemed, without it, merely arrogant. He would give his brother that. He was not unreasonable, but the prophecy had not been given to Lily or James Potter before they died. It had not been given to Sirius Black before he was taken to Azkaban, and Aberforth found himself, for the first time, wondering whether that would have changed anything. It was not being given to Harry, who was 15 months old and could not receive it yet, but who was being shaped by decisions made in its shadow. The prophecy explained why Albus thought he was right. Aberforth had never been arguing that his brother was wrong about the magic. He had been arguing about who had the right to know. He looked at the interrogator, who was sitting with her hands folded on the table and her expression arranged in a way that suggested she, too, was doing a considerable amount of interior accounting. The chamber was still very quiet. Several members of the Wizengamot were looking at Albus. Several were looking at the middle distance with the expression of people discovering that the flaw of what they thought they were hearing has revealed another flaw beneath it. Aberforth waited. He was practiced at it. He thought, now we find out what this court decides to do with a prophecy. The hearing had entered a phase that Aberforth, who had been watching it from the inside, would have described as the phase in which the room is no longer comfortable with itself. This was distinct from the earlier phases, in which the room had been attentive, or formal, or quietly moved, or professionally neutral. It was now something closer to unsettled, in the particular way that institutional rooms become unsettled when they are being asked to look at something they did and did not at the time examine closely. The Wizengamot had been in session for 4 days. Its members had heard testimony from Hagrid. They had heard the prophecy sealed and read into a classified record. They had spent the morning recess doing what 50 witches and wizards in plum robes do during a morning recess, which was to talk to each other in low voices and then stop talking when anyone outside the group approached. The interrogator called the session to order and asked Albus to address the matter of the godfather. Albus rose. He had the manner he always had in this room, composed, attentive, the bearing of a man who has spent decades standing up in difficult places and has developed a kind of structural stillness about it. But Aberforth had been watching the architecture of that composure for 4 days, and he had developed an eye for the specific configuration it took when Albus was preparing to say something that he found genuinely difficult. "To Sirius Black is Harry's named godfather," Albus said. "This is not in dispute. On the night of the 31st of October, when I dispatched Hagrid to collect Harry from Godric's Hollow, I did not contact Sirius Black, and I did not give him the opportunity to take Harry in." He paused. "I want to explain why." The room waited. The Potter's location had been protected by a Fidelius charm. A Fidelius charm is of no use if the secret keeper has been turned. If someone who knew the location told Voldemort where to find the Potters, only a person who had been told the location directly could have done so. I did not know, on the night of the 31st of October, who the secret keeper was. I believed it to be Sirius Black. I was wrong, but I did not know that I was wrong. What I knew was that the Potters were dead, and that one of the very small number of people who could have betrayed the charm was a 21-year-old wizard who had reason to know exactly where Harry was. Dispatching Harry to Sirius, under those circumstances, was not an option I could take. He sat. Aberforth waited for 2 beats. Then he said, "I'd like to ask the court a question." The interrogator nodded. He did not look at Albus. He looked at the assembled Wizengamot, which he had been looking at for the better part of 4 days and had by now divided, approximately and imprecisely, into those whose expressions tended toward procedural attention, and those whose expressions tended toward something more interior. He addressed the room. "Sirius Black is in Azkaban," he said. "He has been in Azkaban since approximately the 2nd of November. He is 21 years old." He paused so the number could settle, because he had found that the number tended to do work when it had a moment to sit. Was he tried? The silence had the quality of a silence that is not empty. I am not asking a rhetorical question. I have not been able to establish, in the time since I filed this petition, that there is a trial record. I have been told by the Wizengamot Administration Services that Sirius Black was committed to ministry custody on the 2nd of November 1981 and transferred to Azkaban the same day. Did the Wizengamot hear his case? Did he stand before this court and have the opportunity to speak? Was a verdict returned? The interrogator's expression did not change, but something altered in the stillness of it. The answer, delivered after a brief consultation with the member to her right, was no. "He is in Azkaban without a trial," Aberforth said. He said it without emphasis. The sentence did not need any. I want the court to consider this alongside the question that has occupied us for 4 days. This court is being asked to determine the appropriate guardian for a 15-month-old boy. This same court declined, on the night of the 1st of November, to determine whether the man that boy's parents chose as his godfather was actually guilty of anything. He let a moment pass. I am not saying Sirius Black is innocent. I do not know whether he is innocent. Neither does this court, because it never asked. He looked at the assembled benches with the steady look of a man who has decided not to soften the next sentence. You failed that boy on the 1st of November. I am not here to tell you that you did it deliberately, or that the circumstances weren't difficult, or that there was a great deal happening all at once. I am here to tell you that it happened, and that you are now being asked to make a different decision about the same child, and I would like you to make it differently. He sat. The room was very quiet. Then, from the respondent's side of the chamber, Albus rose. Aberforth did not look at him immediately. He heard his brother stand, heard the small sound of his chair, and waited. "I did not prevent the imprisonment of Sirius Black without trial," Albus said. His voice was level and quiet, and without any of the qualifications or procedural framings that had characterized most of his other statements in this room. "I was aware that he had been arrested. I did not intervene. I did not contact the Wizengamot on his behalf. I have not done so in the weeks since." A pause. "I cannot defend this. The due process that Sirius Black was not given should have been given to him, and I had the standing and the influence to ensure it was, and I did not use them." He was quiet for a moment. "My brother is correct that this court failed Harry Potter on the 1st of November. We agree on that, apparently. We agree on very little else, but we agree on that." Aberforth had not been expecting the concession to feel like anything in particular. He was surprised to find that it did, not the warmth of agreement, which was too far, but something smaller and less comfortable. The recognition that his brother, who had been opposing him in this chamber for 4 days, with every tool available to a very intelligent and very experienced man, was capable of saying a plain thing plainly when the plain thing was also the true thing. He did not find this comforting. He found it in a way he did not entirely want to examine. Worse. The interrogator called a brief recess. When the court returned, she delivered a formal ruling on the question of Sirius Black's status. His trial was a separate matter, one the Wizengamot would need to address through an independent proceeding. The current hearing could not determine his guilt or innocence, and the court's ruling in this matter would not presuppose either. What the court acknowledged was that a man imprisoned without verdict could not be appointed guardian of a child. The structural consequence of the institution's own failure was that the named godfather was not available as an option. The court noted this as a constraint on its deliberations, rather than a conclusion. Aberforth listened to this. He thought it was, by the standards of institutional acknowledgement of institutional failure, about as direct as he could have expected. He also thought that Sirius Black was still in Azkaban, and that acknowledging a failure was not the same as correcting it, and that this was probably a thought for a different hearing. The interrogator asked whether either party wished to make a closing statement before the court retired to deliberate. Albus indicated he had said what he needed to say. Aberforth stood. He had thought about what he wanted to say last, and whether it should be different from what he had said in the middle. And he had concluded that the part he most wanted to land was the part he thought the court was most likely to misunderstand. He wanted to correct the misunderstanding before the deliberation, rather than after. "I want to be clear about what I am asking for," he said, "because I think it may have got buried under the other parts of this proceeding, and I would like it to be the last thing the court has in its mind when it leaves this room." He looked at the interrogator, and then at the assembled members, taking a moment that was not theatrical, but was deliberate. "I am not asking you to give me a child as though winning an argument entitled me to a prize. I am asking you to ensure that there is a person, a named, legal, wizarding person, who is accountable for Harry Potter, who can be contacted by the ministry when something happens, because things will happen. They always happen, and at present there is no one the ministry can reach, who can speak for him in rooms like this one, who can intervene, if intervention becomes necessary, without having to file 3 petitions to get through the door." He paused. "Whether Harry lives where he is or somewhere else is for this court to decide, and I trust that it will weigh the magical arguments and the practical arguments, and make the determination that it believes is correct. I have my view, and my brother has his, and the court has heard both. What I am asking for, underneath all of it, is simple. I want there to be a name on a document. I want the name to be reachable. I want whoever holds that name to be bound, by law and by record, to that boy's welfare." He looked at the bench directly in front of him. I want that person to be me. I believe I have given the court sufficient reason to agree. I'll let it decide." He sat down. The interrogator thanked both parties and called for a recess of deliberation. The Wizengamot rose, plum robes moving in the amber torchlight, and filed out through the side doors in the orderly and purposeful way of a body that has spent 4 days arriving at a set of questions it is now required to answer. The chamber emptied, the scribe rolled the final parchment carefully and capped the inkwell, and departed without particular ceremony. The torches burned. Aberforth remained at his table because there was nowhere he needed to be, and the hogshead could run itself for another hour, and he sat with his hands flat on the surface in front of him and waited for what came next. The antechamber they were shown to was a stone room, with 2 benches along opposite walls, and a window near the ceiling that let in a rectangle of grey November light. There was nothing else in it except the quality of waiting, which was substantial. Aberforth took the bench on the left, Albus took the bench on the right. The ministry attendant who had shown them enclosed the door with the careful click of someone removing themselves from a situation they had correctly assessed as not requiring their continued presence. The room was perhaps 8 feet wide. Aberforth looked at his hands. He was aware of Albus on the opposite bench in the way you are aware of something you are choosing not to look at, a peripheral weight, a quality of attention that his peripheral vision had already processed without being asked to. He kept his eyes on his hands. He had the hands of a man who had been pulling pints and moving casks and doing the general physical labor of a pub for the better part of 6 decades, broad and capable, and not particularly elegant. He had looked at them a great deal during this hearing. They were becoming familiar in a new way. Albus was looking at nothing. Aberforth checked this once briefly from the corner of his vision and confirmed it. His brother was sitting upright in the composed and attentive way he always sat, and his eyes were directed at a point on the wall above the door that contained nothing worth examining, and he was looking at it with the absolute focus of a man who has found something to rest his attention on. 82 years. Aberforth had done the arithmetic more times than he found useful in the past 2 weeks, but here in this room it came back to him with the particular texture of a fact that does not diminish through repetition. Ariana had died in August 1899. He had broken his brother's nose over her grave. They had not spoken again, not meaningfully, not in any way that counted, until Aberforth had filed a legal petition and the ministry had sent Albus a formal notice requiring him to respond. 82 years of living in the same small country, orbiting the same events at different distances, never finding the thing to say that would make any of it smaller, and here they were, in a stone room 8 feet apart, waiting for 50 people in plum robes to decide a question neither of them could answer for themselves. Aberforth found he had no remark to make about this. He suspected Albus did not either. They waited in silence for 40 minutes. Neither of them broke it. When the attendant knocked and opened the door, Aberforth rose first. He did not wait for Albus, and Albus did not try to walk beside him, and they returned to the Wizengamot chamber in single file, and went to their respective positions, and stood while the court resettled around them. The interrogator waited until the room was fully assembled. She had the formal posture that courts assume when they are about to produce something that has been arrived at through considerable deliberation and now needs to be delivered cleanly without inflection. This court has reached a determination in the matter of Dumbledore, APV Dumbledore, ABP. On the matter of guardianship of the minor H.J. Potter. She paused. The scribe's quill was ready. On the question of residence, she said, the Wizengamot finds as follows. The bond of blood charm described in testimony, a charm anchored in the sacrifice of Lily Potter and requiring for its continued effect that Harry Potter reside in a dwelling maintained by a blood relative of the deceased, is active and intact. This court accepts the testimony that the charm is sealed and cannot be transferred without destruction of the protection it provides. Given the present circumstances, the survival of individuals loyal to the former Dark Lord, the particular nature of the threat to the boy identified in the sealed testimony of this session, this court finds that disrupting the charm's conditions would create a danger to the minor that outweighs the benefit of removal. Harry James Potter shall remain in residence at 4 Privet Drive, Ive Little Winging, Surrey, under the care of his current Muggle guardian, for so long as that guardian maintains willingness to house him and the terms of the charm remain intact. Albus had not moved. Aberforth had not expected him to move. This was the part his brother had argued for, and the Wizengamot had heard it the way you hear a strong argument, which is to say, it had been persuaded by it. Aberforth had not come here to fight the blood protection. He had said this. The ruling confirmed that he had been heard. On the question of wizarding guardianship, the interrogator continued, and her voice did not change, but the quality of the room's attention did. A small collective shift, 50 people leaning slightly forward, in the way of those who understand that the second part of a split ruling is about to be delivered. The Wizengamot finds as follows. She looked at Aberforth. This court finds that Harry James Potter has no designated wizarding guardian of record. This court further finds that the absence of such a guardian constitutes a gap in the boy's legal protections that this institution has a responsibility to address. Given the circumstances of the boy's godfather, whose guardianship cannot be established without resolution of a separate proceeding regarding his imprisonment, a matter this court notes it is separately obliged to pursue, and given the absence of any other formally designated wizarding responsible party, this court finds that the petition of Aberforth Percival Dumbledore is meritorious. Aberforth kept his hands flat on the table. Aberforth Percival Dumbledore is hereby named Wizarding Guardian of Record for Harry James Potter. This designation confers the following: legal standing, the right to be consulted on all wizarding decisions made on behalf of the minor, the standing to intervene through appropriate ministry channels, in any wizarding proceeding or determination affecting the minor, and the right to be notified by the Ministry of Magic of any event of wizarding significance affecting the minor. This standing shall persist until Harry Potter reaches wizarding majority on his 17th birthday. She looked down at her parchment, then back at the room. This ruling does not alter the minor's residence or the existing magical protections as described. It names a responsible person. The ministry is directed to update its records accordingly. The hearing is concluded. The sound of 50 people returning to the world was the sound of robes moving and chairs adjusting, and the low murmur of an institution settling back into the shape it occupied before this particular exceptional week. Aberforth sat for a moment without moving. He had won what he had come here to win. He understood this. He found he did not feel any of the things he had expected to feel, which was perhaps because the thing he had won was not the thing he had started out wanting. When he filed the petition, what he had started out wanting was harder to name and had never been on offer. And the thing he had actually won, a right to be notified, it was not nothing. It was the closest the law could get to making things right, and he had known that before. He filed the petition, and the knowing of it had not changed in the past several days, and it did not change now. He looked at Albus. He had the look of a man who had fought for something, and secured part of it, and was engaged in the interior process of accepting the part he had not secured. He did not look defeated. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man who expected to win everything and has accepted winning half, and who is deciding, with the particular mental machinery he had always possessed, what to do with the new configuration. His face was composed and his hands were still, and his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was thinking about something that was not in the room. Harry would stay at Privet Drive. The charm would hold. The protection Lily had died to give her son would persist. Aberforth could not take the boy. Albus had been right about the magic, and the Wizengamot had agreed, and that part of it stood. And Aberforth was the wizarding guardian of record for the boy. The ministry would notify him. He had standing. He existed legally in that child's life, in a way he had not existed last week. Albus had been right about the magic, and Aberforth had been right about the rest. The chamber continued to empty. Aberforth stood. He had nothing to gather. He moved toward the corridor that led to the stone stairs, and he was nearly at the entrance when he heard his brother behind him, and he did not turn around. He stopped walking. He stood with his back to the room. "If anything happens to that boy," he said to the stone ahead of him, "that you knew about and I didn't," he stopped. He started again. "I'll know. That's what you've given me today. I'll know." He waited a moment, in case Albus was going to say something, and then he continued walking when it became clear that he was not. Behind him, the sound of Albus's footsteps continued at the same pace they had been keeping before, steady and unhurried, the footsteps of a man who has somewhere to be and is going there. Aberforth climbed the stairs into the ministry corridor without looking back. He was back behind the bar by 7:30. This was later than usual, but the regulars of the Hog's Head were not, as a rule, people who concerned themselves with the barman's schedule. They came when they came, and they drank what Aberforth put in front of them. And they did not ask where he had been, partly because they were not the sort of customers who asked questions, and partly because the particular culture of the Hog's Head had always been one in which a person's business was that person's own. And this applied to the barman as much as to anyone else. He set down the document from the Wizengamot behind the bar, under the cash box, in the place where he kept things that needed to be kept. He poured himself a measure of fire whiskey, and did not drink it. He pulled the first pint of the evening, and slid it across to the figure at the end of the bar without looking up, and the figure paid for it without comment, and the evening got started. The inn was the same as it always was. The low beams, the unswept floor, the smell of something, fire, damp stone, the persistent and unidentifiable animal quality that the building had carried for as long as Aberforth could remember. The glasses on the shelves behind him, not precisely gleaming, which was the most that could be said for them. The tables scattered across the room, occupied by the usual collection of figures who hunched over their drinks with the specific posture of people who have selected this pub over the others available in Hogsmeade for reasons they prefer not to discuss. He served them. He refilled. He collected the empties and rinsed them and stacked them in the way he had stacked empties and rinsed glasses for decades, and the evening moved the way evenings move in rooms like this one, which is to say, slowly and without interest in its own progress. He thought about the piece of paper under the cash box. He was Harry Potter's wizarding guardian of record. He had legal standing. The Ministry of Magic was required, by a ruling of the Wizengamot, to notify him of any event of wizarding significance affecting the boy. He had the right to be consulted. He had the right to intervene. He had, in the most precise technical sense the law could produce, a role in that child's life. He had never been to Surrey. He had no particular reason to imagine what 4 Privet Drive looked like, and his imagination, shaped by the descriptions that had been introduced into evidence during the hearing, did not produce a welcoming picture. He had never held the boy, or seen the boy, or heard the boy make any sound at all. Harry Potter was 15 months old and had his mother's eyes and a scar on his forehead, and was currently, by order of the Wizengamot and the mechanics of ancient protective magic, in a house in Surrey, being watched over by people Minerva McGonagall had publicly described as among the worst muggles she had encountered. He was asleep, probably, or awake, and doing whatever 15-month-old children do, which Aberforth had no immediate expertise in and would apparently be required to develop. He was the wizarding guardian of a child he had never met, who did not know he existed, who was sleeping in a place Aberforth could not take him from. He picked up a glass and set it down. He thought about Ariana. He did not think about her often. He had spent 82 years finding ways not to think about her. Not because the thinking was unbearable in some dramatic sense, but because it went nowhere. It arrived at the same place it always arrived, which was a summer in 1899 and a fight that should not have happened, and a girl who should not have been caught in it, and then the ground and the grave and the crooked nose he had put on his brother's face, and the silence that had started that day and never really ended. He had learned a long time ago that thinking about it produced nothing useful. There was no version of it that came out differently. He thought about it now anyway, because it was relevant in a way it had not been relevant for most of his adult life. He had not fought for her. He had been 17 years old when she died, and he had loved her, and he had been furious at everything that had been done to her and everything that hadn't, and in the end, it had not been enough to do any good. He had not known how to fight for her. He had not known what fighting would have looked like. He had stood at the edge of it and been too young or too late or simply not positioned correctly, and she had died and the silence had begun, and he had come back to this pub and stayed. He had fought for Harry. He had filed the petition, and he had stood in the room, and he had said the true things plainly, and the Wizengamot had listened. He had a piece of paper. The boy was still in Surrey, and the charm was still sealed, and Albus had still won the part that mattered most to Albus. But there was a piece of paper, and Aberforth's name was on it, and that had not been true a week ago. He did not know if it would matter. He had sat in that chamber this morning and heard a prophecy. He had turned it over in his mind while the room was silent, and he had turned it over again on the way home, and he had arrived at the same place each time. The boy would grow up in a house in Surrey, not knowing who he was or what had been decided about him, not knowing about the scar or what it meant. And somewhere ahead of him there was a reckoning that the prophecy described in terms that sounded like inevitability, dressed in the language of chance. Either must die at the hand of the other. Either one of two possible outcomes. Aberforth had handled enough uncertain situations to recognize when something was being called a choice that was, in practice, the narrowest possible corridor. He was the guardian of a boy who was going to have to walk through that corridor. He poured a second measure of fire whiskey and did not drink this one either. From where he stood, he could see the corner of the room, down 2 steps, around a partial partition, where the private area was. The area where, in January or February of 1980, his brother had sat with a woman interviewing for a position, and where something had been said that had been overheard by a young man Aberforth had thrown out into the cold. He had not known when he did it. What had been said, he knew now, or he knew the summary of it, sealed and classified, which was that the boy in Surrey was marked, and the man without a body was not finished, and it was going to come down to one of them in the end. He looked at the room, the low ceiling, the strange figures hunched over their drinks in the amber light, the glasses, the bar. He had been standing behind for longer than most of the people in this room had been alive. This was his life, and he had chosen it, and he had never been ashamed of it, and he was not ashamed of it now. He had also never been responsible for anyone in it before. Not officially, not legally. Not in a way that someone could find on a document. He thought, tomorrow he would write a letter. He did not know who he would write it to. The ministry, perhaps, or a solicitor, or simply a letter addressed to the question of what a wizarding guardian was actually supposed to do in practical terms when the child he was guardian of was living in Surrey with muggles and could not be told any of it yet. He did not know what the answer was. He suspected there was not a clear answer, and that he was going to have to find his way to one in the manner he found his way to most things, which was slowly and without assistance, and by being more stubborn than the problem. He picked up the fire whiskey he had poured and, still not drunk, and set it on the bar in front of the customer nearest to him, who accepted it with the suspicious gratitude of a person who has been given something for no apparent reason. He opened another bottle. He served the next customer. Outside, Hogsmeade was quiet on a November evening that was not celebrating anything and had no particular reason to, and the stars above the village were the same stars that had been there last week and would be there next week. Indifferent to the rulings of the Wizengamot and the mechanics of ancient magic, and the question of what was owed to a boy who didn't know he was owed anything. Aberforth did not know what the next 16 years looked like. He had a general sense that they would be difficult, and that there would be decisions he wasn't given the information for, and that his brother would continue to carry things in the manner his brother had always carried things, which was alone and convinced and just wrong enough to matter. He had a piece of paper, he had legal standing, he had, for the first time in 82 years, a reason that went beyond stubbornness to keep watching. Tonight was just tonight. He refilled a glass. The fire burned low, and the regulars hunched over their drinks in the way they always did, and the hogshead was the same as it had always been, except that Aberforth Dumbledore was, for the first time in his life, someone's guardian. He had no idea